Welcome to the Red Rose Film Club, a movie podcast that examines the wide world of cinema through our perpetually lefty, pinko commie, soy boy, cuck, Antifa, super soldier filter. But more specifically, we love movies and want to create a podcast that would appeal to the disparate tastes of our liberal, leftist, socialist, communist, Marxist, and Leninist friends. Red Rose Film Club is for leftists of all stripes who don't know what to talk about at parties other than movies and politics. My name is Craig. I work in public education and am passionate about social justice and workers' rights. And I'm with...
Hey, I'm Hal. 2024, I'm switching it up and taking it back to the basics. I'm a socialist trying to grapple with our world by reflecting on it through art, theory, the will of the people, and in this instance, shit. And today, I am so excited to share that we have a very special guest, a man of many titles and life experiences, best friend, critical English studies PhD candidate, union leader, poet, teacher, tennis player, late night email muser, queer theorist, the best art museum date, and a man whose ass I very only narrowly beat in fantasy football this week. Less than 2 points, y'all. Jared, one of the true loves of my life, and I have a shared history with film that extends across a few decades now. Back from when I, circa 2009, borrowed his family's Hell Night DVD, which is a 1981 Linda Blair starring slasher directed by Tom DeSimone, who also made Hal favorite Reform School Girls, though I didn't learn of that flick until about 15 years later, to playing drinking games, to the worst creature features that we could absolutely find in our early 20s. Shouts out to the Carmen Electra starring Two-Headed Shark Attack. And by starring, I mean she dies in the first 3 minutes.
Hey.
Yes, spoiler alert. The shark has 2 heads. To our shared love of Grease 2. And to most recently, our prancing through some scandalous cinema together. If you're interested in that, you can see films we've watched together under that heading via the Hal and Jared Take Each Other to School tag on my letterbox. So when Craig and I were talking about launching this Italians and Fascism series, I knew I wanted Jared and all of his insights to be part of that journey with us. Jared and I actually watched all 3 of these movies together over the last month and a half as we prepped for this series. Suffering, crying, questioning, bleeding, scribbling notes across the country from each other, but with one united purpose. Jared, welcome to the pod.
Yay.
Hi.
And this is actually the first time I've met Jared in person. We've interacted in social media and all that, heard all the lovely stories indeed. But I'm excited to talk with Jared as well because this movie is fucked up and I need people smarter than me to help me grapple with it. But before we get to the movie, Jared, we want to talk about your kind of journey with film, your love of film. Can you tell us kind of what are some early memories you had that got you on the movie lovers way?
Oh. Okay, sorry, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
Internet just went out for a second. Of course it did, right when I'm supposed to talk. Hi, it's so nice to be here. It's nice to see Craig too. I've heard your voice so much. I've been a long time listener and first time, I guess, caller now. But thanks for having me. I'm Baba Booey. I'm super excited to be here. My journey to film has been very. It's with everybody, it's changed drastically over the years. It was just Friday the 13th the other night, and I spent that night reveling in nostalgia with me and my late brother, who we used to stay up and every Friday the 13th watch 1 through 8, eating spoonfuls of coffee grounds for no reason. And
I was with you until that part.
We were 8 too, but that was my first foray into it. I remember my dad showing us Halloween when I was 6. And so slashers are really my first entree into movies, and I became obsessed with them. And especially the Friday the 13th, Halloween, John Carpenter's is probably top three favorite films of all time. And then, as I got a little older and a little gayer, I, kind of branched out a little bit. I remember seeing Sleepaway Camp was one of the
Yeah.
transformative screenings of my youth. And then, I went to high school, and, you're trying to figure out, I was pretty openly gay at that point, but I was like, what kind of gay am I? You have those questions. So I was watching all the rom-coms and the quote unquote chick flicks, and I still love them very dearly. And um, then I went to college. Luckily enough to go to college with my BFF, Roz. Shout out Roz. And she showed me. She had a little bit more of a formal education with her family, who made her watch a lot of like old classic films. So she kind of gave me an education in that capacity, where I just watched all these old classic Hollywood movies, and I started to learn a little bit more about like filmic language and how films work formally. And my scholarship is in my scholarship's in American literature and culture and queer theory, but at the time I was doing like formalist poetry stuff. So it was like, oh, I can actually read a movie in the same way you read a poem or a book of literature, right? And so I was kind of doing that with these older films, learning how to understand just the basics of talking about them, which is actually a course I'm teaching now, which is literally called "What is this? How to Read Art." So I tell students there's like languages to these things. So once I kind of understood that, I just started watching more classics, more obscure stuff. Hal, of course, is a weirdo, so Hal showed me all sorts of weird stuff. And during the heydays of the pandemic, like we were, watching. Hal started having us like having me watch a lot more like prestigious movies, and that was really really great and a really important education to me. And then I think it was about a year and a half ago or so, maybe even less. Hal showed me Barry Lyndon, and I would say that really changed my life. I was like, I love a picaresque. I've always have. I've written about it. And just that movie, what a movie could do without being pedantic and didactic, and telling viewers how to think about it, and letting viewers come to the movie on their own terms and understand that you can't like every character, and maybe you shouldn't like every character. And then after that, it's just been Hal and I kind of, when we can find the time, just watching just a classic, and it's been a really wonderful education. And then all of a sudden we're watching shit eating. So
like you said, a classic,
classic and shit eating. Yeah, but I really enjoyed your two episodes on in this series already, and those two, I love The Damned. I've been thinking about that endlessly. But it's been a really fun 3-movie trilogy here of this, so I'm really excited to talk about it with you guys.
Oh yeah, can I make an admission? I think I've said this before on the podcast. Never seen Barry Lyndon. It's like one of the only Kubricks I've not seen. I have it over there somewhere, and just haven't. It's like 3 hours, which I have like a mental block on with a 3-hour movie, especially one that I know is going to be, like a big, maybe not a lift is not the right word, but like, I want to give it the respect it deserves and like sit down and watch it. And I always have a hard time committing to a 3-hour movie. But
so here's what I'll say
yes.
about, I mean, I could say many things about Barry Lyndon, but I think that Kubrick's other massive, weighty, canonical films are perhaps distorting your understanding of what this will be.
Yeah. Okay.
It is much lighter. Like in tone, right. It is much lighter than,
it's kind of like a goofy, like fuck about.
Right. It's a picaresque. It's a guy wandering through life, fucking up. And despite his best intentions, or in line with his best intentions, he floats up the social mobility ladder and then he descends down it again. Mm-hmm. But it does not feel like it is nearly 3 hours. And it certainly emotionally is way lighter. This is not 2001: A Space Odyssey, where you're like, all right, I'm going to prepare thyself to sit down and be exposed
beat the shit out of each other.
to the development of humanity. It is genuinely a good time. Like, I would really like to emphasize that it is a good time.
Yeah, it's always been one, that I've been meaning to watch for decades now and just haven't. I also have it on DVD. So like every time I go to watch it, I'm like, I should watch this on something a little bit more nice looking. So I keep having excuses of putting it off, of like not watching it.
Meanwhile, the copy I have of The Devils is not a DVD at all. It is a torrent that my husband found.
Oh hell yeah!
That is English language audio with perhaps Turkish subtitles on it, that in the middle just sometimes turn into another language that I can't identify, and it's like grainy and pixelated, and I'm like, yes, this is the only way I can watch this movie.
The way film was meant to be watched.
So I will say Barry Lyndon too just is pictorially one of the most beautiful movies. There's his frames in that movie that I was like, this is a painting. It just looks like a Rococo beautiful painting, and it that really, I think, struck me too. Like, I understand plot, filmic language and things, but like it was just so
it's gorgeous,
beautiful and captivating that these scenes where Barry's just like reclined, they make thematic sense, and everything just it recuperates into that sort of beautiful cinematographic language.
Yeah, so I think what Jared and I are saying is we're going to start a fascist regime, and that the only mission of it
make me eat shit and watch Barry Lyndon.
Forcibly watch Barry Lyndon.
You're like that Florida State fan who deleted all their accounts after saying they're going to eat shit when they lost their first.
Oh, I don't know about this.
Oh my god, me either. I am so glad to be blissfully unaware. I'm surprised it hasn't been brought to my attention at work yet.
So this season of Florida State football, I have been I was raised like FSU fan, and then when the like Jameis Winston shit popped off and like the terrible response, I was just like, fuck all this. I'm not rooting for these idiots. So that was like 10 years ago, and this season I was like, you know what? let me dip my toes back in and see how that feels for a minute.
So,
and then they've gone 0-3.
I think what I have to say here is that it sounds to me like your timing is very much on par with Barry Lyndon, and that I think
making wrong choices all the time.
You find some coincidence of spirit.
Hell yeah.
So, Jared, you told us about your love of cinema and how it evolved over time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of your academic background and the framework or frameworks that you operate within and that you might be bringing to the table here?
Sure. My academic, I'm working on a dissertation. I'll finish in the spring on what I call forming queerness. I can't even remember the title now. It's forming queerness of experimental forms in queer lineage and post-Stonewall American lit. And what I'm doing in there is kind of tracing literary entanglements with the development of queer theory in and outside the academy. In particular, looking at the works of like Audre Lorde and sort of her eroticisms that are kind of extrapolated from like hypersexuality, where an eroticism is instead a kind of political efficacy that's rooted in a sort of spiritual relationship between people rather than it's obsessively sexual. And then conversely, I'm looking at very hypersexual plays by a guy named Robert Chesley, whose archive I just visited a few months ago, and he's like totally under the radar, and his plays are all very erotic, very sexual. He does a lot of fantastical imaginaries of sex positivity in the world of AIDS, and he himself died of AIDS in 1990, but he was very against the sort of kind of liberal gay agenda of like, it's your fault that everybody's dying of AIDS because you're not doing safe sex practices, and he's attacking people like Larry Kramer and all these, Terrence McNally, all these other kind of 80s playwrights writing around that time who are very kind of sex negative, and Chesley's doing a lot more kind of fantastical imagining of what a reclaiming of sexual autonomy in an era of epidemic can do. And then I finish it off talking a little bit about a really great contemporary novel that everybody should read called Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, which is about a gender and sexual shapeshifter. And it's a Bill Jean Roman. So we're just watching Paul kind of quite literally change their body in relation to the sort of social worlds they want to inhabit. So sometimes they grow a bigger dick. Sometimes they turn totally into a woman when they're in a lesbian commune. Sometimes there's one scene where he's cruising in Boys Town in Chicago and he grows huge muscles. And along the same line, we're getting all this sort of intertextual citations of queer theories, queer cultures, like Patty Hearst's Horses makes an appearance multiple times, and Robert Mapplethorpe's photo of Patty Smith, sorry, Patty Smith's album cover there. It's yeah, Patty Hearst magic.
Patty Hearst,
that'd be crazy. But essentially, yeah, I just am really interested in, especially writing right now. I'm writing a lot on Bersani, Leo Bersani, and kind of Foucault and Hockey Gem. I'm so sorry to the French.
I know that motherfucker has Hawk Louis of a name.
Yeah, it truly does.
He's a French dude. He kind of like is, if you look him up, he is like kind of a controversial personal life.
Okay.
But he's a major player.
Okay. Yeah, very big sexologist guy about sexual liberation post 1968 and France. But essentially looking at how these scholars and theorists are thinking about sex. And, I think where Foucault kind of falls, and what I've been kind of working through in relation to this is where Bersani picks up, is that Foucault doesn't talk about sex, he talks about sexuality, whereas Bersani is all about sex and all about penetration and the eroticism of that, and what we can actually understand about sex if we kind of take it away from something like an identity politics there. So it's been really fascinating. It's been really fun to kind of write through these and think about Bersani, who's like big into like BDSM and all sorts of wild, crazy sex shit. Thinking about how he relates to all these questions of like fascist sexuality that we saw in these last three movies.
Yeah, I think it's something that I'm excited to dig in a little bit more when we get to that point, but some of these themes of like mutability of sexuality, or excuse me, of sex and gender, mutability of sex and gender, and how like some of the things you just said or theories that you talked about situate that as a like liberatory practice or a way of trying to conceive of what liberation could look like or how to explore the possibilities of liberation. Whereas like, as we'll talk about in Salò, instances where we see mutability of sex and gender is destructive, right? Like it's a way of barreling down the boundaries of self in a way that is the state intervening, as opposed to the state or aristocrats intervening, as opposed to like individuals doing so in a freedom-seeking, liberty-seeking, self-defining sort of way. So kind of that the dialectic of sexual freedom, if you will.
Yeah, and I'll be bringing a little bit of Bersani into the conversation because that's his bread and butter there. But it's always hard to talk about that kind of stuff when you're like, but this is torture.
Right. But they're torturing them. Could you say the name of that novel again?
That's the exact same thing.
Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl. It's by Andrea Lawler, who's a professor at Mount Holyoke. Great, 2017. Fantastic book.
Yes.
Awesome.
Hell yeah. Well, so are we ready to
start to dig
in? So for this episode, because of the enormity of the mission we've outlined for ourselves today, the plate is full and heaping, y'all. We will be foregoing of shit. Good shit in this instance. We'll be foregoing our usual up top bits, God, excuse me, I'm drinking beer. Anyway, we'll be foregoing our usual up top bits of like the recent pop culture consumption and current events. They'll be back in 2 weeks for our first October Halloween episode of the year. But for today, we're going to follow the structure we've laid out for our previous 2 episodes in this series of Italians covering fascism. That is, we'll talk about some historical context for the period depicted in the film. We also add in a little bit about of course, the filmmaker and also Marquis de Sade because of the content of the film. Also, we probe into what does this movie communicate about what fascism is? Or stated another way, how does this movie define fascism? We're interested in what this film can say about how power is patterned under fascism. Then we'll also try our damnedest, because it is a massive task, to disentangle themes of gender, sex, and sexuality with regards to fascism within the scope of Salò. Then we're going to talk about themes that emerged across all three of the movies, what we learned, and also I want to dig into a little bit of this idea of like, what is the capacity for film as a mode to make meaning out of meaning annihilating regimes, right? That's one of the reoccurring themes that we talked about in the previous two episodes, and will come up a lot here as well, that like fascism annihilates meaning. It is destructive. So how can film make meaning out of this nothingness, the wreckage of the nothingness? Now, let's begin our descent into Salo's circles of hell by starting out with the man, the myth, and the legend himself, Pasolini. So, Pier Paolo Pasolini was a leather jacket wearing gay Marxist Catholic who made movies, wrote poetry, put out political analysis, directed theater, translated text into a variety of languages, taught, produced, and traveled prolifically. Pasolini was the kind of socialist who focused on the lumpen proletariat. If you're not familiar with that word, what we mean are people who are usually considered by Marxists to be outside of the revolutionary class. They're considered to be an underclass. It often includes people like those who are experiencing drug addiction, sex workers. He viewed those folks as having revolutionary potential. And he said things like, the real Marxist must not be a good Marxist. His function is to put orthodoxy and codified certainties into crisis. He was the kind of artist who sought total control over all parts of his movies, even down to holding his own camera. He literally filmed Salò himself. He did have a director of photography, but he literally held the camera. He made, in my estimation, the single greatest film about Jesus ever made. And in that film, the Jesus stand-in fucks a whole family. This man's a genius, y'all. So, do either of you have any other favorite Pasolini movies?
I'll let Jared go first because my answer is going to be boring.
I don't really have. I've only seen two others of his trilogy of life, Sans Arabian Nights. Watched the Decameron while Hal fell asleep about 15 minutes in. Classic Hal thing. And I love the Canterbury. Love the Canterbury Tales. I love that he heightened the crudeness of both of those films quite a bit. Thought they were great.
Mine begins and ends with Salò. It's the only Pasolini movie I've seen. Yeah.
Oh man.
I know. I've been meaning to watch Pigsty forever. And then I would love to see the trilogy of life and all that as well, but I just haven't.
And also if you're not aware, and since neither of these two dudes have seen it, the movie that I'm referring to is called Theorem.
Okay.
Is where Terrence Stamp, young Terrence Stamp, looking
good,
hot, and frightening, just piercing blue eyes into your soul, moves in with a family and then proceeds to seduce every single member of the family. And it's definitely a metaphor for Jesus. It absolutely, beyond the shadow of a doubt, is. So
it's like a Parasite fucks.
Yeah. For God.
For God. Yeah, hell okay.
Yeah. So, and I'm a huge Pasolini lover. And I also, I mean, I have not seen a movie of his that I disliked. Another one that I'll elevate is Mama Roma, which is about a aging sex worker in Rome. Really great. A lot of his movies are like neo-realist in style, black and white, really stripped down. And outside of this movie, Salò was quite a departure for him in terms of film approach. All of his other movies were largely made with like amateur actors that he would just kind of set up and let them do their thing, and kind of see what emerged. Not without any writing. There was a script. It wasn't totally organically, but done organically. But he was not highly formalist in his approach on any level, and that shifts very distinctly in the approach that he took to Salò, which we'll talk more about later.
Feel like you can still see some of that though in Salò, of the kind of like not formalist approach, especially with the actors, and like the teenagers in it are all kind of nameless,
very raw.
yeah. But yeah, I've only seen one. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll do a Barry Lyndon Pasolini double feature one night. That a bad idea?
I'm trying to
Just said how
decide.
lovely Barry Lyndon is. Do I want to? I
I
guess
mean,
if I
the
do,
rest of his
yeah,
movies, I mean, Pigsty is definitely the most um politically incisive
right.
and like intense. It not nearly on
Yeah,
the level of
but his other
Salo.
movies are not in the
Right. Many
same
of his other
vein
movies
of
are like
right. Yeah,
explicitly
yeah,
religious, like the Gospel according to Saint Matthew.
yeah, yeah,
He's just like an Italian neo-realist religious film, basically. Um, but I don't know that any of his movies would like pair. I have to think about that a little bit more. But I would say if you're going to watch, if you're going to prioritize watching a film, Theorem is his,
Theorem.
I
Okay,
think, most perfect film, like
cool.
in terms of every element harmonizing together in service of delivering a singular experience. It is his best made film.
Cool.
Would be my recommendation.
I also watched a few like documentaries on him on like the making of this, and like this is such a like a dumb guy observation, but he looks cool as fuck.
Yeah, he absolutely,
He's just like a
absolutely, he
absolutely
absolutely.
baby. He just like the glasses, the like he
Leather
just looks like
jacket.
yeah, the leather jacket, just like gesticulating wild. I just he seems cool as hell.
There's a movie from somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago called Pasolini where Willem Dafoe plays him, and it's
Okay.
not the greatest movie, but I mean it's Willem Dafoe.
I can see that. Yeah.
And it's him playing Pasolini at the very end of his life, like surrounding basically the production of Salo.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think it's worthwhile.
Okay, cool. I want to check that out. Well, that's a good transition into talking a little bit more about Pasolini. Pier Paolo Pasolini, his life was tragically punctuated by violence. No surprise, given he lived through the period depicted on screen in Salo in the 1940s. He fled the University of Bologna. Did I get that? Thank you so much.
I'm horrible at pronouncing things, so it sounded good.
I was just glad I didn't
Sounded
say
right.
Bologna. He fled the University of Bologna, where he had been studying art history due to the fascist regime. And his brother was eventually killed as a partisan, where he was fighting a civil war against the fascists, the occupation by the Germans, and engaging in class struggle in the town near where their mother was born. And cruelly, a few weeks after this movie, being Salo, was completed, Pasolini was found brutally murdered on November 3rd, 1975. In the year preceding his death, as he prepared to make Salo his final film, he participated in a 1974 debate in which he urged artists, critics, and the public to create, defend, and support works so extreme that they cannot be devoured by capitalist machinery. And he may have succeeded. When Salo finally debuted, it had to repeatedly dodge censorship, and its first screening was not even held in Italy, it was in Paris.
So we're here today to talk about this art that is so radical it repels. But before we wade through its scatological resistance,
Hey.
we'll locate this film in the time and place Pasolini sets it, the Republic of Salo. So before I go into this, I'm going to say, I think on the last episode, I said some real dumb shit because I did not realize that the Republic of Salo was a real place. Maybe not real dumb shit, but I just made some comment about like, oh, I didn't know that that was like a real thing. And so I learned a lot. Learned a lot in writing this section, I'll say.
I didn't think you sounded dumb.
Okay, well,
I'll just put that out
mea
there.
culpa, I didn't know what the fuck I was talking about, and now I do. Following
As the one who rarely knows what he's talking about, I'll say you sounded great.
Following Mussolini's ineffectual campaigns in World War II, which killed many Italians, while failing to restore Italy to national glory or reclaim any of the lost lands, you know, the whole reason that fascism, like the whole mission that it had and said that it was going to do. And that's why they were, supposed to be able to take control. The Allies invaded Sicily on July 10th, 1943, and the fascist Grand Council passed a motion of no confidence on July 24th, 1943, after which Mussolini was arrested.
In his wake, the newly implemented government was a military junta run by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, a loyalist of the king's court, intended to restore monarchical order. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a state where fascist laws remained on the books. Italy continued to outwardly align with the Third Reich and did not move to expel the German forces, while not so secretly cozying up to the Allies. Seeing that the weakened state was moving toward flipping sides, Hitler moved swiftly to squelch the possibility of the Italian peninsula becoming an entry point for the Allies by fully occupying the northern third.
On September 8th, 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies. And as historian H. James Burgwin writes, some Italians felt that they were experiencing, quote unquote, the death of the nation. Here we see that fascism's destructive thrust dismantles its own project. The South, at this time, still run by Badoglio, aligned with the Allied command, while in the North, Hitler and the Germans temporarily restored Mussolini to power, establishing the Italian Social Republic, or the acronym in Italian is RSI, from the town of Salò on Lake Garda on November 25th, 1943. Hence, the Republic of Salò. Mussolini surrounded himself with old violent men chosen for their dyed-in-the-wool fascist credentials rather than their strategic insights. He stayed here, play acting in a Nazi fascist puppet state with his decrepit bureaucrats and fading thugs until the Allies broke the dam in northern Italy in 1945 and overtook the Germans in a deluge of force. The film we take as our subject today, Salò, obviously, projects Mussolini's zombified fascist scheme and pathetic final act through the prism of Marquis de Sade's writing.
And the Marquis de Sade was a noble-born aristocrat known for salacious writing and even more scandalous rumored behavior, and was imprisoned in both jails and insane asylums for nearly 30 years in revolutionary France. In 1785, he wrote 120 Days of Sodom. His libertine reputation and mythologized life make it tempting to read the tome literally instead of as a philosophical text that contemporarily has been understood to be conversations with Voltaire or Hobbes and as an influence on Nietzsche. In Roland Barthes' 1971 essay, The Life of Sade, eventually published in Sade, Fourier, Loyola, more on that in a moment, the theorist cautions against reading Sade's work as a biographical and instead emphasizes that through his writing, Sade was attempted to craft his own reality. I'm so sorry, but every time I want to say Sade, and I know that's not right, and I have to stop myself every single time. Barthes wrote, "We need only read the Marquis' biography after having read his work to be convinced that he has put part of his work into his life and not the opposite, as so-called literary science would have us believe. The scandals of Sade's life are not models of analogous situations drawn from his books. Real scenes and fantasized scenes are not directly related. All are no more than parallel duplications, more or less powerful, stronger in the work than in life, of a scene that is absent, unfigured, but not inarticulated, whose sight of infiguration and articulation can only be writing. Sade's work and his life traverse this writing area on an equal footing."
So we raise this for a few reasons. Because this Barthes work is one of the texts that is listed in the bibliography at the beginning of the film. So if you haven't seen Salò, or as a reminder, if you've seen it in the past, the credits open up with a list of literary and philosophical and theoretical texts. And it says bibliography. Right?
Literally says, yeah.
That is the prologue to the work. So this article and the book that it's taken from are included in that bibliography. And thus, Pasolini uses this text, including what we just read, to contextualize his work and to set, and we also want to set our intention that we're not too interested in speculating about Sade's extracurricular activities or biographic peculiarities. You know, maybe some other day. I am really fond of Sadian adaptations in general, like 1963's Vice and Virtue, which Catherine Deneuve is in, or 1977's Justine, The Misfortunes of Virtue. Great, maybe in the future, but for today, we're treating it as a literary text, right? So there are a few shared themes across the text that Pasolini highlights in that bibliography. Some of these themes include one, like we just talked about, avoiding psychologizing Sod and treating his work as essentially theatrical and oriented toward spectacle. Two, that Sod's lawlessness and irrationality have the effect of producing an ambivalence toward both idealism and materialism. Like he's kind of caught in this contradiction and dialectic in the theoretical space. And also that the underpinnings of Sod's specific brand of nihilism is that he conceives of man's autonomy as being derived from man's relative insignificance to nature. Basically, that in the face of nature, man doesn't mean anything. Therefore, he can do whatever the fuck he wants, to put a really pin in it. These are intended as sensitizing concepts, ideas to get us activated, to think, for example, about Pasolini's formalism in his filmmaking here, the lack of emotion in the film, and how power is understood, but not the be all end all of analysis. So, before I feel like I've said this 17 times today because we are really staging it. We are scaffolding it in today. We are sliding down the ramp towards the movie. But before we fully dive in, do either of you have a history with this film in particular? Had you seen it before? And if so, what were the circumstances?
I had seen it before, maybe like 10 to 15 years ago, when I was doing what is I believe a rite of passage for all like film fans, which is like, where's that list of like the most fucked up movies ever made? And let me go ahead and check those off. So I was aware of Salo as being a super fucked up movie. I want to say that I watched this in a 48-hour period with Cannibal Holocaust, because I was like watching those types of like shocking movies.
You're basically like a little monkey. You put electrodes in your brain, and you said, "Let's shock it."
I was doing the like Clockwork Orange thing to myself. Yeah. Which, by the way, I actually was thinking of Cannibal Holocaust during this because both the Salò and Cannibal Holocaust, disgusting movies with like really beautiful but subtle scores, which I forgot that Ennio Morricone did the music for Salò. And Cannibal Holocaust, if you have either of you seen Cannibal Holocaust? Yeah. It is not good.
Jared's shaking his head.
No, I have not. No.
It's terrible. It is like, it's not.
I've heard of it.
It is interesting as like an oddity or whatever, but it is pretty gross, and it's just not a pleasant watch. But it has really nice music in it.
It does,
which is
listen, the Italians were like, we're gonna be disgusting, filthy,
we're gonna
depraved, gorgeous music.
And well, what's more fucked, and I would say of the two, Cannibal Holocaust is more fucked up because as far as I know, Salò doesn't kill any animals or living things, which Cannibal Holocaust does a few times.
You should give your listeners a poll and have them.
Yeah, which movie is more disgusting?
It's Salò. Which one's more disgusting, I think. But what about you, Jared? Had you seen Salò before?
It was. I'll say one thing real quick, just as a side note that always makes you laugh. One of the things I love about being very close to Hal and knowing them for a super long time, I was staying at their home recently. And I woke up, it's like 9 a.m., 9:30 a.m. And I hear just ruckus in the living room. So I walk out, and Hal's just like locked into watching the persecution and assassination of Jean-Paul Marat performed by the inmates of the asylum of Sheraton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade, which is based on a play by Peter Weiss. And that was just like the most Hal moment of my life. And that movie, the 45 minutes I caught of it, it's especially waking up and then you're watching this insanely formless play that's bonkers. So highly recommend that. No, but it was like I've heard of it. It was an open secret. The damned and then the condemned, and it was like, it's gonna get worse. It's coming, Jared, it's coming. So I was waiting for it, but no, this was my definitely first interaction with that.
There are some way it makes sense in terms of maybe we'll talk about this at the end, but it makes sense in terms of chronology of when the films were released, and it also makes sense in terms of the chronology of what's being depicted.
Yeah.
But there is the fact that it's like The Damned is very intense, and then The Conformist is significantly less intense, though not devoid of that kind of activation. And then it goes I'm like,
maybe ramping up.
Yes, maybe it should have been mixed around. But I think I'm almost positive I've said this on the pod at some point in time in the past, or maybe while talking about preparing for this, but I have seen this movie before once. I was 18 years old. It was second semester, like spring semester, senior year of high school. I was friends with a group of people that introduced me to a lot of film. I realize now in retrospect is they basically just owned a lot of Criterions. Like now as an adult, I'm like, oh, that's what was going on. But at the
you're gonna love
age like 16, 17, 18, I was like, wow. It's still great. I'm not in any way denigrating them. I'm so thankful for them. But I just realized now that all the movies that I think about them, I was like, that was absolutely a Criterion collection.
Also testament to like the good work that Criterion collection has done for so long, because that's how I learned about a lot of movies too.
Yeah, for decoding.
Criterion puts their stamp on it and as something worth watching. And
for sure. Yeah, definitely not an insult in any way. It just kind of cracks me up to reflect on and be like, I was like, oh, they're discovering all of these things, and then they shared it with me, and it's like they bought these things at Barnes and Noble during the 50% off sale that they do twice a year. So shouts
don't
out
sell
to
in
them.
Our store in town. Every time they do their 50% off, I go, do you guys have a Criterion section yet? And nope.
You can get them online. They do the sale online, which because last time they did it is when I bought Women in Love.
Great
movie. The Blu-ray of through Criterion. But Ross, Dylan, and Austin, we were at Austin's dad's house. And it was like something we prepared for, like they were like, okay, whatever day of the week it was probably like a Friday night, like you're gonna come over and like we're gonna watch like the movie, and Dylan is a expert level baker, and for some added like Roger Corman, William Castle ass effects, made cupcakes using like flavors that are described. I read a bunch of the essays in the Criterion collection where issuance, where they say like what they made the shit out of. Okay. And she mirrored the flavoring to reflect that.
Oh God.
So if you're wondering, I was gonna save this for later, but I realized I'm telling this now, so I might as well share it. They make it out of it's orange marmalade, and then like chocolate is why it has like the texture, and like crushed up cookies basically is why it like has that texture and is like has a gloss to it, etc. So she made chocolate orange marmalade cupcakes.
Okay.
We watched this movie. I will say I found it fun fact about me, prior to basically the last 5 years of my life, I had a pathological response to shit, like vomiting. And I still sometimes, I've gotten over it a lot by having dogs, but it's still sometimes I will just like instant gag reflex. Like, no, there have been poor times where Mike comes home and I'm like, I'm sorry, you have to clean, throw up, and poop off the ground because of my response. So I think I just frankly blacked this shit out, because there was about 25 minutes into the movie that I remembered, and then stuff started happening where I was like, I have zero recollection of this, and I absolutely remember that whole, it's not like I went to sleep or lay down or left. Like I think my brain just said no. So this experience went well, relatively speaking.
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up, because that period of absolute repulsion by anything doo-doo related is still where I am.
Fair.
And you mentioned Mike having to clean up all the dogs. That is still the dynamic between my wife and I, where I'm like, I will do almost any other gross thing that you need me to do around the house, but I have a problem with the dog shit. So when it got to that part of the movie, it might be the only time I've watched a movie that we've done for this at 2 times speed, because I could not handle the shit. I was needing it to be over quickly because I was struggling.
Very fair. I will save my response this time for when we get to that point. But I will just say, like, I fully believe that I like blacked out. Like my brain was just like, no, I don't think we'll be internalizing any of that. Thank you so much.
I didn't remember how long the shit eating is in the movie. I thought it was
for
like
me,
a
it's
scene.
the opposite.
Oh,
is
really?
that the fact that it takes so long to get to it was not what I recalled, or it was not the memory I had imputed. So
well, let's maybe talk about the plot a little bit, because there is more plot than just eating shit, which if you listen to it this long, it sounds like this is a movie only about eating shit.
Exclusively about shit eating.
But at the same time, the plot is fairly thin as well. So let's do just a brief walkthrough. Bernardo Bertolucci, director of The Conformist that we watched last episode, he called Salò atrocious and sublime, and it really is one of the most unpleasant films ever made. Salò, or 120 Days of Sodom, is Pier Pasolini's indignant and angry film about the depravity of fascism. And normally we would structure this episode around kind of a walkthrough of the plot, but we're going to do it a bit differently this time. One, since the details of the plot are deeply unpleasant, and as Pasolini intended, the specifics aren't as important as they were in other movies. So I'm going to do a speed run through the plot so we can dive into some of the political theory at play. As mentioned, Salò takes place at the end of World War II in northern Italy during the waning days of Mussolini's pitiful final act. A group of fascist libertines, a banker, a duke, a bishop, a judge, and 4 accompanying sex workers in the town of Salò, intent on acting out a sadomasochistic ritual of dominance and degradation, kidnap 18 teenagers, 9 boys and 9 girls. For 4 months, they hold them in a villa, degrading and torturing the teenagers, inspired by the notion that nothing is true, everything is permitted. Inspired by Dante's Inferno, Salò is broken into 4 chapters: Anti-Inferno, the Circle of Obsession, the Circle of Shit, and finally, the Circle of Blood. Pasolini, that's a fun one. Pasolini shoots the film in beautifully framed, often static wide shots, but hardly ever in close-up. The 19 teenagers aren't characters in a traditional sense. Most are unnamed, and we don't really ever see them outside the scope of the horrendous acts they must endure. Pasolini doesn't give the audience the catharsis and comfort of a narrative, and instead makes the audience passive participants. Salò is Pier Paolo Pasolini's angry lament of fascism and the collective shame we all bear for allowing it to flourish. At the end, where we see the 4 bureaucrats swap roles amongst themselves while killing the remaining living teens, Pasolini wrote in the script that, thus, each one of us will in turn have the philosophical pleasure of contemplation, the particularly abject pleasure of complicity, and supreme pleasure of action. So, first things first, let's get our initial reactions. We talked about watching it, that we've seen it before. What did we think this time through? Jed, why don't we start with you, since this was your first viewing of the movie?
Sure. Yeah, I just in the beginning scenes. Also, I just want to know that I think there's kind of as much as this film's depraved and has horrible visuals, and I also gagged a lot while watching it. I put my head in my hands during the whole wedding ceremony scene. Essentially. There was some humor at times, which surprised me. There's right in the beginning, there's some bottoming jokes, like by way of the fascists are talking about like which dick would feel better. There's kind of visual gags in a way. There's like dick trees. There's Pasolini. I think this movie to me is essentially about sex and this sort of fascist depravity. But I mean, I wrote down a couple quotes just that I think are exemplary of it, which is like weak chained creatures designed for our pleasure. And I'll just say that. And then, of course, nothing is more contagious than evil, which is very Nietzschean of Pasolini there. But it was a horrifying movie in that way. But again, I think there is, the sort of sort of like un inability of, as you quoted Bertolucci there, the atrocity is so pure and kind of simple in a way that the sort of sublimity that Bertolucci is talking about, I think, speaks to the sort of extra textual nature of the movie, which is like the sort of humor, the especially, I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but like the sex workers telling these stories that
Yeah.
are horrifying, but they're kind of funny and they're outlandish, and they're performing these huge gestures and they're doing all sorts of crazy, storytelling in the middle of a movie that's not kind of telling a story, not really telling a story. But I think the Bertolucci gets it the best, that it's there's a kind of sublimity, like the endlessness of the violence. You can't really understand it because it's unconscionable to viewers, but at the same time, it's undercut with intertextual realities. There's Proust, there's Barthes, there's Nietzsche. There's all these figures that contextualize the movie in a world that is so unfamiliar to us, and I think what the end of fascism really points to, especially in Italy, and in the late or the mid 1940s there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think something that really struck me on this viewing that relates a bit to what Jared is saying is that um we've talked a lot in this series about how fascism is world destroying. And we'll talk more about that in a moment too. But I think something that's really notable about the way this film is constructed is that it is film destroying. It's narrative destroying. It is like breaks our understanding of what a narrative should be, right? And like what it means to have a plot driving a film. Like it is very like didactic, but it doesn't use the kind of communicative tools that you would expect for a film that's very didactic, right? Like instead it's disgusting, filthy. It really stirs up a lot of emotions um in ways that we do not expect, right? I do not anticipate total like penetration of all bodily systems going into a film, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like fascism is world destroying, and that's captured in what's happening on screen, but also the way Pasolini has constructed this film is mirroring that. It's communicating through mode as well, and form, as well as through content. And I will say my general reaction to this movie is that I think it is appropriate for me to watch it once every 15 years in my life. It was 15 years ago that I saw it. I found it to be very deeply moving in a way that I wasn't quite expecting. I was just expecting to kind of stay in the horrified zone. So I do anticipate rewatching this movie at some point in time, but I think that could wait until I am 48.
Yeah.
I think I'll wait 15 years.
Yeah. And I'll be 35 in 15 years.
Oh,
So that's
wow.
probably when I'll watch that.
Is
I'll be
that
25,
illegal?
so that's
Is
great.
that illegal? Are 20-year-olds allowed to watch this movie?
I'll say on my watch this time, like obviously the first time I watched it, I was maybe not watching it with the like the I don't know. I was just like a dummy 20-something guy that wanted to watch those list of fucked up movies. And I understood at the time, what it was trying to say about fascism, maybe not to the degree I do now. But what struck me more this time is how what you wrote in the intro about Pasolini trying to make something like kind of angry at capitalism and consumerism and wanting to make something about fascism that was actively anti-consumerism and anti-capitalist, that
right, like you can't co-opt me.
Yeah, you are not going to be able to take this and make it like, you're not going to be able to put this on like a TBS Saturday afternoon viewing or whatever.
This is not Ants,
right? Yeah.
Or Bug's Life.
Yeah.
Damn. Ants is so fucking weird. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be sorry, but I saw Ants in the theater. And like
Oh,
as a
wow.
kid, and I
Okay.
remember even
Talk
as a
about it,
kid,
Grandpa.
I know. I remember even as a kid being like, "This is fucking weird." This movie is because I had also seen Bug's Life, and I was like, "Why is this one making me like my stomach hurt watching ants?" And then I was
Why
like,
did they
"Oh,
make
Woody Allen is the voice. That might be it."
why did they crossbreed Madawan with with a monk slave?
Hell yeah.
And then make Woody Allen
Yeah.
be voiced by
Oh
Woody
boy.
Allen.
But yeah, this time I was more like invested in that element of it, the idea of like making something that's like beautiful but actively like actively disgusting for like an anti like consumerism point of view. And then I one of the documentaries that I watched about him is he is there's a lot of interviews with him, but he is like angry talking about his headspace going into Salò and how like everything like he's fought for and against has like culminated in this, and he's just like fed up and sick of it, and this is bullshit. And like I feel like that is that like that anger and that like transgressiveness really stood out for me this time as well.
Yeah,
And
I'm oh go
oh,
ahead.
I'm sorry. Like even the cinematographer, a terrible Italian pronunciation, Delicoli, I think. I don't know. No, we'll just leave it at that. I mean, even the first 10 minutes, when you have the sort of lineup of picking, which ones have the best dicks and which ones are the most fuckable, and the juxtaposition between like the Delaric buildings and then these vibrant green grasses, they look so false and they look fake, and it's kind of this like omnipresence of this regime that's dying. And then you cut to the mansion, and of course it's palatial, beautiful, grass is the same kind of green, and there's people there who are participatory in it. Like there's workers there. We can talk about the worker that gets killed later on, but there's a sociality of it all that I think was kind of surprising, that there's a kind of microcosm of this like vestiges of this like green grass that's just like waiting to die, right? And that's was quite shocking to me in terms of like the narrative world of the movie. Like one thing I like about the other two Pasolini films I've seen is that he takes the Decameron and Canterbury Tales, are both movies that are plotless, or both books that are texts that are plotless, but they have tales. Like his understanding of like a progression of a story that isn't necessarily, I don't know, developmental, I think is quite masterful here. That while there's not A to Z plot, there's still momentum, there's movement, there's thought. And again, I keep coming back to his textuality and his bibliography, is contextualizing this world that they're inhabiting, that's so grotesque and horrible. But I just kept the first 15 minutes, I just kept going back to that green grass. It was just so vibrant and so unsettling. It looked fake, it looked false. And then of course you get one of the great villain shots too, right at the beginning of the movie, where they're all in their little a balcony there, and they're looking down at the 18 teenagers, and it's one of the great villain shots. It's like all, what is it, 7 8 of them that are just lined up, and they look grotesque too. They're like in so much makeup and so
different kinds
much.
of fucked up.
Yeah.
That one guy with the one like hella crossed eye just all the time, that guy is the most menacing to me.
Oh, I I had nightmares about him after watching
He looked like Teller from Penn and Teller,
God.
which I couldn't stop thinking about either. It was like
there's something, and kind of relates to the trilogy of life. There is a little bit of this kind of like medieval sentiment of grotesquerie, where it's like the grotesquerie reveals the evil, right? Like the evil is worn outwardly. I think with the libertines that we see, he could have gone and recruited like the most beautiful, elegant, dressed them in fineries, though we'll talk about some of the fineries later. That gown, wow.
Which one?
The gown that
Miss Vicario, yeah, oh, I love
Vicario
her.
wears.
I can't remember.
The sex worker who tells most of the
Oh,
stories
yeah.
up through the
I thought you meant
beginning.
one of the gowns the libertines are wearing in the scene where they're
Oh
all in
no, at the
dresses
very
and stuff.
end.
Yeah,
No, one of the sex workers. But so let's talk about fascism a little more explicitly. So, based on what we see on the screen, Craig, how do you feel Pasolini is defining fascism here?
I think to me what stood out the most as defining fascism is the like complete degradation and breakdown of the individual, the person, right? I think partly seen mostly through the filmic language of the fact that this movie doesn't offer any insight at all into the lives and who the people who the 18 teenagers are. We don't hardly ever see them talk to each other. We don't see them outside the bounds of being tortured. There's like twice where they say like they address each other by name and someone's like I can't go on, and there's like you've got to, and those are literally the only times where we see them having like human emotions other than fear and terror. And I think to me that is what stands out the most about defining fascism, is that like complete degradation and removal of the self and the identity. And that that is what really stood out to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it definitely connects with some of the stuff we talked about in previous episodes where fascism as like a body destroying system. And I think about in one of the previous episodes, I think it was in The Conformist, I talk about a Susan Sontag chapter called Fascinating Fascism, where there's a lot of things she says in that. But one of the things that kind of stuck in my brain is she talks about that fascism involves the turning of people into things, right? The literal objectification of the people that occupy the state. And I think we absolutely see that here, where the all of the 19 you right? No. 18, excuse me.
Yeah.
All of the 18 youth.
9 and 9?
I think 17, I think, because one is killed on the way
right,
to the
like immediately.
yeah, on the
But
way
like
to
yes,
the villa.
of the youth, they are instrumentalized, right? They are simply turned into function. Like you said, they barely have names.
Few of them, but yeah,
right, they don't have like fully fleshed out emotions. They are dehumanized not just through the actions of the libertines, but in like the insights that we have, which is to say we don't have any, right? They're just turned into instruments for fulfilling the desires of the libertines,
and I
potentially fulfilling. We'll talk about that later.
One part that really stood out to me with that about the like removal of self and like that struck me as so fucking sad was it's later on in the movie where one of the sex workers who's in charge of like maintaining order with the girls in their like room points out to one of them and she's like, she's a troublemaker or something like that. And you've never seen that in the movie at all. And it just begs like, oh my God, what was going on that we didn't see that was labeled her the troublemaker? But we don't even get that comfort of being able to see them like fight back or resist or whatever was going on, where like we know that they are actively resisting this because it's referenced. But I think Pasolini's committed to the idea of like that removal of self, that we're not going to see that at all in this. Like that's too much of a comfort to give for this.
And it's logic destroying, right? The point is that cause and effect, the idea that there's a chain of actions that are linked to each other, it relates to that idea we've talked about before of fascism as destroying continuity, right? That we can't say A leads to B, which leads to C. The fascists tell us C, and we're have to presume or try and piece together, right? Weave together the narrative that existed prior to that point in time. It's like every level of analysis, fascism comes in with a hammer.
And if like I guess I've been thinking about it conversely. Like it's, to me, it's, I see these horrible things happening to these youths and who are, denied. Torture, of course, is a reduction of a destruction of any agentic power and identification. But there's this moment where they're just all the fascists are drunk and talking, and one says, and then they go into this debate about who said it, Barth or Nietzsche or Proust, or, and it's the limitation of love is that you need an accomplice, and there's I
Mm.
think something compelling about that, of like thinking about the sort of motivation of a of a of a of a fascist figure. Like, what does it mean to be able to do these things besides just like being the easy answer of being just heartless and moralless? It's what drives those motivations. And is it a kind of shared camaraderie? Is it a kind of a grasp at of a sort of, as Nietzsche would say, like a pursuit of love that is impossible because of your moral like degradations, that you can't love because you're so immoral, but you pursue those things through your sort of degradation of other people. And I find myself thinking a lot about especially the, I think it's the Duke with the weird eye guy.
Yeah, I believe so.
It's the Duke, and I find myself thinking about him a lot because he was so horrible, but he was also revered and kind of loved by these other fascists. Like when we are starting to get the degradation of the characters and early on, before they kind of remove them to another room and they're just like, go over there, and then it's like they're at dinner, and then he just like whips out his ass and is like, hey, I'm gonna get fucked in front of all these other people, and I know that's for the pleasure of these people. So the servitude of the parts of the whole was something really interesting to me, because that's the fascist agenda versus these characters getting degraded and losing autonomy, losing agency, and not having any identification anymore. And that's, to me, the kind of project that Pasolini seems to suggest, is the pursuit of a wholeness versus the total degradation and loss of identity of those who don't support it, right?
Well, I think some of what you're talking about here relates to um a theme that I saw and also was drawn out through a reading I did. I read this article by a scholar named Vinhe that he published in 2007 called Liberation Hurts, that is applying like a psychoanalytic lens to Salò. And the kind of thesis of that, or the question it takes up as the center of its thesis, is, do the libertines attain pleasure in this
Mm-hmm.
movie?
Mm-hmm.
And is desire actually fulfilled, or is it just a continual exercise of a drive, that drive almost is outside of their control? They're never like, essentially, they're never coming, to make it really base, like to
Right.
get
Yeah,
really
yeah.
base with it, right? Like it's like eternal masturbation, never coming, psychically. And I think this meets with or dovetails with some of the things that are in the movie, and also connects to some of what you were saying, Jared, where there's this anecdote in the movie where they talk about how an executioner must kill many because the act is not repeatable. So, right, as it relates to love requires an accomplice, well, the thing about death and destruction is that your accomplice goes away, they
Mm-hmm.
perish, right? It's not repeatable. And so in order to fulfill the desire that an executioner has, they must kill many people. You basically turn into a genocidal maniac because of the act of love is not repeatable
Mm-hmm.
um in that instance. And I know that when I was reading through some of the other texts that are in the like bibliography that Pasolini puts at the beginning, one of the scholars that he listed is an essay by a guy named Kowalski. And in that, Kowalski talks, in the text that's listed in the bibliography by this guy, he talks about the idea that sodomy is the most, in some ways, the most perfect sexual act, because it can be done repeatedly without presenting its own barriers. So, right, like where heterosexual penetration can produce pregnancy that can get in the way of continuing to fulfill the desire, sodomy does not. And we also hear in the Circle of Obsession section that one of the libertines says, we are driven by a frustrated desire. So I think there's a lot of things intermingling here, but it is that there is something that Pasolini is saying about people in power trying to pursue a wholeness through love, but because of the distortion of power, it's funneled through the prism of power. They cannot reach absolution that comes with repeated, or as they say, gratuitous, is how Kolosky refers to it. Repeated, the repeated task of forming together to accomplish love, right? Like they destroy. That is what they do, is they destroy. They cannot repeat, basically. They cannot repeat with the individual.
And I think one of the, moments when the film is kind of cascading to its end result, there's a moment, we could talk about this more later, and I think it's Eva, one of the teenagers who is caught having sex with another woman. It was fascinating that the result, well, it's obvious that they're going to kill them because they are pleasuring each other, right? And one of the things I've been thinking about with Bersani, he's right, pain is the organism's protection against self-dissolution. And in a way, we have this moment where we get these two women actually enjoying pleasure in a way that dissolves all the horrible atrocities committed to them. And of course, that's, what the problem is that the pain that they should be experiencing that kind of at once destroys them, but also kind of reaffirms their autonomy because they're still alive, they can feel, is the thing that drives them crazy, that people have pleasure, that they have pursuits, and they could feel something outside of just total destruction. And I think maybe that's a reading we could do here, is that no matter the pain inflicted on these people, besides quite literal death, is that no matter how much pain they are being inflicted on, they're still people, because pain is a reaffirmation of selfhood, right?
Yeah, and the girls are trying, I think another way of conceiving it is like the girls are trying to build their own world, even if it's just
Yeah.
for a moment,
Yeah.
right? Like they're trying to restore. And the last thing I'd like to say on sorry, just on this thought is that I think to go back to the quote that Craig read, that Pasolini had in the script about from the very end of the movie, where the fascists are engaged in, they each take the turn of engaging in contemplation, complicity, action. I think that triad, and really contemplation is like voyeurism, right? It's voyeurism, complicity, action. That is a way of trying to create the repetition that is love, right? Within this framework. Like that is their effort to build in a substitution, is to complete this cycle where they are all enmeshed and each take the turn to see, to enable, and then to do. It's like all they have is this triad that leads towards destruction.
Well, we have talked a little bit about Nietzsche, who kind of looms large over this movie, but do we want to dig into a little bit more on Nietzsche?
Sure.
All right. Well, why don't we do this? Because I feel like you guys are both a little bit more versed in political theory and philosophy than I am. So why don't I kind of give you my not at all educated everyman take on what I understand Nietzsche, and you guys tell me where I'm wrong and where I'm right.
All right.
All right. So having not really read any of Nietzsche's like texts or anything, just being aware and having a slight rudimentary understanding of philosophy, I know of Nietzsche as his main philosophies being like empowering the self, kind of the idea of the Übermensch, make yourself kind of this almost Ayn Randian sense of like individualism conquers over all, and that could be used in a almost inspiring sense, but can also be used in a very quite fascist sense. Yeah, how do I feel about that? Where am I wrong or right?
So, I mean, you're definitely right in general. What I would say as a modifier is that in general, Nietzsche is not saying that people anyone is not saying that anyone can take up the mission to become an Ubermensch.
Okay.
He has some beliefs in functionally innate differences. He takes a very like aristocratic view.
Gotcha.
So it's not that he's saying like anyone can take on the mantle and self-improve to the point of becoming an Ubermensch.
Okay.
He is saying like there are lower men and there are higher men.
Okay.
And you can, by letting go of slave morality, which is what he calls Christianity,
Right.
and letting go of like basically embracing illiberalism, right? Like kind of really stark individuality that is not oriented towards solving social inequality, and in fact thinks social inequality is good, because it enables higher men to continue to self-improve, and because it reflects some inherent value that the people on the positive end of the inequality spectrum hold. But otherwise, like I think the core of what you're saying is what fascists cling to in Nietzscheism, right?
Apologies for the comparison, but I am brain rotted by stupid people on the internet. I'm getting a lot of like incel alpha male like Andrew Tate-ness from the general vibe of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I would say like his history is a little bit more complex than that, in that so Nietzsche's philosophy is very much a response to the Enlightenment, right? And the projects of the Enlightenment, which we now understand to really be like classical liberalism and Marxism.
Okay. Right.
Now, if you're not familiar, listener, I've definitely talked about Marxism in this way, and I am a Marxist. This is what I'm saying is not an insult. It is philosophical and scientific history and the history of thought, that really these come from the same historical moment. They develop from the same historical moment, and they contain very similar ideas of a teleology, meaning like that history progresses through stages, that there's inherent progress that can be achieved, that we're engaged in the pursuit of progress, and that you can go from stage A to stage B to stage C to stage D, etc. Nietzsche does not believe that there is like an end destination or final progression as it relates to like resolving the conflicts of humankind.
Right. There's an end destination for the individual Ubermensch, or the few Ubermensch that exist.
Right. Yeah. And that may take generations or like literally hundreds of thousands of years to pursue.
Okay, so I find a lot of him is a lot of what he has to say I don't find very interesting and necessarily as a philosophy that I personally would adopt, but I find it interesting in the sense that it is descriptive of certain types of people.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, other things that we have seen that would be mirrored in as it relates to how fascists use it, either in Italy or currently right now in the state of Florida, fuck you, DeSantis, is there's like also this like lack of belief in free will. And there is some pretty significant moral relativism, even if not like that is the outcome of the philosophy, not necessarily how its proponents might present it, right? But the end of the day, there's the belief that like the people that are benefiting from social inequality, that are these higher men that can pursue becoming an Ubermensch, that like they should not be subjected to the same rules and laws,
right? Okay,
that lesser people are, that lower men are, right? And it really rejects passivity. Now, I will say there is a thread of like leftism that tries to reclaim might not even be the right word, but there's some of Nietzsche that resonates with that. The anti-Christianity, that motherfucker hated Christians.
He really did.
And also that he was very focused on like creation and like that you should be pursuing your endeavor, your life, excellence for yourself. Like there are parts of that can be resonant, right? For leftists, but in general, his ideas just baseline reflect many similar principles of fascism or that lead to fascism. And also his sister, after he died, was a fucking sicko and like intentionally presented and distorted his work, like took it to the table of people that would adopt it as a political project in a conservative, right-leaning way, which again, they probably would have found it anyway, but it just set right-leaning movements on a certain trajectory to be entangled with him.
Cool.
Do you have any thoughts about Nietzsche you want to share before I talk about Nietzsche?
It's so hard sometimes, but it's interesting that Pasolini's kind of embrace of Catholicism and thinking about concepts of the soul and thinking about concepts of good and evil under this like slave morality and all these like I don't know epistemes, because it's just hard to, I don't know, to read these fascists in this film as doing anything other than, I don't know, reify a kind of lack of soullessness. But again, I just am kind of stuck on thinking of these fascist figures having a soul that I don't know, is it rooted in a sort of Catholicism, mysticism, but I really don't know. Nietzsche often stumps me, and the leftist embrace of Nietzsche also kind of stumps me. And I've come back to genealogy of morality many times, and I continue to be stumped. So, dear listeners, help us out.
I mean, I think that if we look at, like, setting aside even what's in this movie, but if we look at like the current right-wing enemies of freedom and their intellectual lineages, like short-term lineages, by which I mean like Moldbug, what's that motherfucker's name, Curtis Yalvin, or like the dark Moldbug.
I don't know who that is.
That really truly shocking to me, given your interest in right-wing ding dongs.
Internet weirdo.
Yes. Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
Have to look him up then.
And like the dark enlightenment folks that that was circulating a lot, and like their influence on
the intellectual dark web.
Yes. And like all of the people that are entangled with Peter Thiel and all of those fuckers. I don't know that trying to reclaim, like, there are enough other little boxes of ideas for us to play with that, like, we don't need to go say, share your toys with us. Like, I don't know that there's anything meaningful for us to gain from trying to like adopt Nietzsche as a leftist project. I think that it is in maybe worthwhile trying to I'm not saying this for right here, right in this moment, we have to solve this problem. I do think it is probably worth trying to disentangle as leftists, to have a strongly rooted philosophical argument for understanding the benefits of some degree of moral relativism that don't fall within this trap, right? Like, that don't fall within what Nietzsche says of like, well, again, those higher men can do whatever they want because it's in pursuit of their higher purpose, and they have the opportunity to double, triple, quadruple their value as individuals in ways that lesser men never could.
He's a high value Chad,
right? But grappling with moral relativism and having a philosophical basis for it is probably a good idea. We just probably don't need Nietzsche for that, you know. But I do want to say, to kind of tie it back to the, I'm always trying to go back to history a little bit. That's one of my loves. Of course, I had to look up like Mussolini and Nietzsche. Like, what was that motherfucker doing? Was he reading? He was reading. He studied him. Mussolini spoke and read German. He wrote articles about Nietzsche in the Italian like fascist journals. And his mistress, Mussolini's mistress, that is, Margherita Safadi, once wrote about first of all, I'll say she wrote a posthumous biography of Mussolini that was very like laudatory, very much intended to be a hagiography, or however the fuck you say that word. I don't think I've ever said it once correctly in my life, but we're gonna try again. Um, and this came out like right after Mussolini died, so she was trying to like establish his legacy, right, like set the tone. She once wrote about the formation of the fascist movement and said, quote, "It was then that on Mussolini's lips began to appear frequently and insistently the word aristocracy." No.
Aristocracy. I like it though.
Oh man.
Hey.
Okay.
I almost called Marquis de Sade for 30 minutes, so you're all right.
Fuck, dude. Okay. Okay. I'm just gonna start this part from the top so that you can just cut out all. Okay.
Here, let's get a clean.
Yeah.
Aristocracy.
Aristocracy.
There we go. Just put that over top of it.
So we know that Mussolini was absolutely influenced by Nietzsche. He studied him. He read him in German because he could read and write German. He wrote articles about Nietzsche's works in the like Italian journals and newspapers. His mistress, Margherita Sarfatti, who wrote actually a posthumous biography of Mussolini, an attempt to write like a hagiography of Mussolini's life to try and define his legacy. She also wrote about the formation of the fascist movement. And she said, and I quote, "It was then that on Mussolini's lips began to appear frequently and insistently the word aristocracy. The constitution of the first fasci and the political discourse with which they were founded is wholly a call to the new aristocracies that came out of the war. The aristocracy of combatants, the aristocracies triniceta," which means first of all, pretend I can speak Italian. But what that means is aristocracy of the trenches, which is the whole reason why I put this quote in here. Obviously, this is a sidebar, but what a great turn of phrase. I mean, horrible meaning, obviously, but aristocracy of the trenches. I'm back in the quote again, in which Mussolini finds again a reflection of those castes of supreme sacerdotal and warrior virtue already longed for by Nietzsche. Wow.
What an asshole.
Indeed. What a huge fucking asshole.
He sounds insufferable too. Like just
Do you know what happened to her?
No. I do not, but I have to say, whenever I read about her, do you know what I picture? This is some real dumb guy shit.
Yeah.
I picture the fucking bitch that's fucking Goebbels in Inglourious Bastards.
Oh, okay.
That has the leopard suit.
Yeah.
That is like fully, because she was like
Incredible.
a journalist and a translator, or she's a writer and a translator.
I don't think anybody knows what Margarita really looked like, so that's as good as canon now. But Jared,
that's just like, that's my headcanon. Like, that's what I picture her as.
Jared, you got really close.
She has a lime hat or something. What?
You got really close when you said, "Do you know what happened to her?" Which makes me think that maybe it was something salacious.
I didn't even know that there was a biography on him right immediately after his death. So
I thought you had like.
Oh, yes. For The Conformist, I read a couple of articles, one in particular that was like comparing a bunch of different biographies of him that were released within like the 10 years after his death, basically.
I don't want to be insensitive to my Italian brethren and sisters, but the Margarita name makes me want a pizza. So,
I mean, a pizza is definitely better than this bitch.
I have done a really bad Italian accent on the last 2 episodes, so I don't think that you are in any danger of doing anything more offensive to our Italian listeners than my like Super Mario Brother level accent.
My love for the Italian goes very deep.
I also add,
wait,
go ahead.
I must say this.
Oh yes.
Okay.
I have not seen this movie. I need to see this movie. I think we all need to see this movie. I think this movie needs to be on this podcast please. Eventually. It's called Cradle Will Rock. Have you heard of this?
Oh, I I have heard of this,
So
and I can't. Oh fuck!
The reason
Tell me.
why I clicked over to it is because, and I'll be real, of course, I'm looking at Wikipedia because was just looking for a quick like how did she die basically. um, and it says in popular culture, actress Susan Sarandon portrayed her in the movie Cradle Will Rock. I'm immediately like, I'm fascinated. Then I click on Cradle Will Rock. Here's how this movie is described. Cradle Will Rock is a 1999 American historical drama film written, produced, and directed by Tim Robbins. The story fictionalizes the true events that surround the development of the 1937 musical The Cradle Will Rock. It adapts history to create an account of the original production, bringing in other stories of the time to produce a social commentary on the role of art and power in the 1930s, particularly amongst the struggles of the labor movement at the time and corresponding appeal of socialism and communism.
That sounds dope.
That sounds amazing.
Okay, I'm looking up this cast too. Hank Azaria, John Cusack.
Oh my god.
Harry Yules, Philip Baker Hall,
Cherry Jones.
I love
John Turturro,
Vanessa Redgrave,
and Susan Sarandon is playing Mussolini's mistress.
Yeah, we need to watch this.
Okay,
for sure.
Jack Black.
Wow,
Jack Black is in this.
Sorry for the very detour, but that's incredibly important. Also, as far as I can tell, that bitch just like died a regular ass death.
Did you say Jack Black was in it?
Yeah, he plays a guy named Sid, according to IMDb.
I guarantee he's like a union flunky. You have to be with a name like Sid. Come on.
Paul Giamatti as well.
And did you know that if you make a joke that you wish Mussolini would die, that Jack Black will cancel the Tenacious Detour as well?
Did you see that he came back though and said like, okay, we're gonna talk about it.
Yeah,
I'm not like abandoning my like 20-year best friend. It's like, all right, man.
Over a nothing.
Paychecks were drying up. Those School of Rock residuals were
right. Well, he got Kung Fu Panda money for days though.
Oh, that's true.
Can I add one other thing about Mussolini that is completely off topic, but I have to say it, is that someone pointed out that the more insane Joe Rogan gets, the more he is looking like Benito Mussolini in general, and I can't not see it now, especially in profile. He's looking like Mussolini. I don't know if Mussolini had 12-inch long nipples like Joe Rogan does. If you've seen those weird photos of him in his ice bath. But,
that is a much better joke than I was going to make. So
I did not know of these nipples. And...
less likely to get the FBI called to your door for sure than what I was thinking.
He for a while was doing these videos where he was like his workout routines and shit, and part of which was like lowering himself into his ice baths where he has like the weirdest nipples man has ever seen. I mean, he is lowering himself into an ice bath, so maybe that's why they're like 17 inches long, but in general
they're growing out to reach warmth.
Yeah, they're very odd nipples.
Last thing about this movie that none of us have seen. Fucking okay, if I told you that a director,
I love this,
a film director played William Randolph Hearst in it,
I have a guess.
I'm gonna give you 3 guesses.
I can't pull his name, but he was friends with Orson Welles and he made Last Picture Show. Peter Bogdanovich.
No.
Good guess.
David Cronenberg.
No, but I'm gonna say warmer.
Okay.
By nature of, I think, approximate age and the genre that he tends to work in.
All right. Damn. David Lynch?
No, God, that would be. I guess he played.
I'm trying to think of
because he played John Ford, in The Fablemans. No, John Carpenter.
I was gonna say that.
Oh damn!
God damn it!
That's crazy.
Sorry for the level, sir.
So now,
okay, so back to episode 43 on The Cradle Will Rock.
So we'll bring it back in to talk a little bit more about fascism.
Yeah, let's get serious now. What about when they ate all that shit?
Oh wait, there's one there. Wait, hold on. What are you doing? You're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead.
No.
There's at least 2 things I want to talk about before that. Yes. The first, which is relatively short, I just want to touch on because I do think that um I think there are some ways that here Pasolini is making like a very specific movie, but then in other ways he is not making a specific movie.
Right.
Like it is not really about Mussolini from 1943 to 1945, right? Despite it being situated in and bearing the name of Salo. But that it really the movie is situated in four different temporalities, which is when it was made, 1974, 1975, two, 1940s Italy, which is what's actually depicted on screen. Three, the last days of the Ancien regime in revolutionary France, 1785, when Marquis de Sade wrote 120 Days of Sodom. And four, medieval Italy, right? The Dante's Inferno was estimated to be written in like, I think it's like 1308 to 1322 or something. I'm pretty close to the time range if that's not perfectly accurate. It's not written down here. Did that off the dome, bitches. So check it out. But the early 1300s. So I think there's one of the most interesting things about this movie to me is that even though Pasolini carries all of this baggage with him in terms of his personal experiences with fascism and surviving it, and members of his family not surviving it, that really it is on a very basic level simply about like the operation of power in an enduring sense, like across time and space. Like there's a lack of specificity to it in a way, at the same time that it obviously is communicating something about a very specific time and place. I don't know. Y'all have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I I agree that that the movie feels out of time, out of place. And like, yeah, Mussolini is mentioned, but it is once, they're in the villa, it is not really any time period at all. Time is almost non-existent. Like we know and I think he says something of the effect at the beginning where he says something like the next 4 months will be basically kind of erasing time for them. And so much of it still feels like contemporary to now as well. But yeah, I like that assessment of the
I also
temporalities.
I think there's also some of it that comes across like you're saying in the filmmaking, because I was reading in one of the essays that's in the Criterion
Mhm.
issue, and from his friend Gideon Bachman, who was on set for several days during the filming. He talks about how initially Pasolini intended for us to basically live through one day, like one full day of each
Oof,
level, like
man.
that the film would
Yeah.
be structured around, right? So when it's in Circle of Obsession, it would be like you would live through one full day.
Yeah.
But that ultimately the way he ended up filming it and the way it's chunked up within those sections, it's not totally coherent, like how long it's
Yeah.
been.
Time is not like linear in this at all. Like, yeah,
Right.
everything is just
Well, and also they're
presented.
like
Yeah.
the traditional markers of time. Like very little of the time is spent outdoors. Really,
Right.
only at the very beginning and the very end of the movie. So we don't have that as a metric. We don't have clothing as a metric because 95% of the time, not most of the people on the screen are naked or nearly naked,
Yeah.
and the clothing worn by the libertines is very ritualistic. It is not intended. It's not like they got up and wore a different thing every day, right?
Yeah.
They are wearing like the vestments of their ritual repeatedly. So I think I don't the essay is a little unclear about like why Pasolini made that choice, but I think it adds, regardless of intention, authorial intention, it adds to that effect of being
Mhm.
a little displaced from time in such a way that we can focus more on kind of like the theoretical meanings of how power operates than viewing it as like, oop, he is directly supplanting Marquis de Sade into the last days of Mussolini's reign.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's like again, I keep coming back to the textuality of the film that we're in texts that supersede this moment in a way, but we're also in other like texts that predate it. But also there's like really great moments where you're in the fascist bedrooms or their dressing rooms, wherever the fuck they are. And there's like Italian futurism on the wall, typically on next to or on walls that are covered in murals that are decaying. So this sort of kind of, again, just temporal juxtaposition of like, here's a kind of fascist art form of futurism against these sort of decadence of, fascist art, or just in general, just like Italian decadence, and then the decade, and then the futurism, and all these things like juxtaposing itself all the time. Same with the costuming, the women in particular, the fascist sex workers are out of time and place all the time. You can't place them. They have kind of accents that you can't really understand. Yeah. You don't really know where they are. But again, the only people giving us temporal legitimacy are the youth themselves. When you find out like one is a son of a judge, one is a son of, or a daughter or son of a professor, there's like sort of real context there, but it's totally extracted from the faux decadence of this space. And I was particularly impressed with Pasolini's kind of decorative way of putting in like futurism on the walls in a way that felt so kind of uncomfortable. When if you look at Italian futurist art, it's very angular and dynamic, and then you're set against these decrepit walls, the paint's chipping off the walls, everything's kind of gray and modular, and but the progression of the story and all the things that Hal was just saying, like, make it atemporal, and that I think speaks to a lot of the themes that we've been talking about, of all these sort of fascist impossibilities that Pasolini is trying to make very relevant to us.
All right, I think it's time, not yet for the shitting. Hold on.
Champing at the
Shit eating.
But for Jared, okay, lay it on us. What the fuck do you think is going on in this movie with regards to the ways that fascism I don't know, circumscribes, employs, exploits, negates, etc. Gender, sex, and sexuality?
My notes are so funny on this because it's like gender and sex, gender without sex, sex without gender. But I will say this movie, I think, imagines sex, and not sexuality. Sex is entirely extracted from gender, but gender is a continual and permeating force in the replication of the ideology. I think entirely about the scenes where towards the end, where the Duke and all the other fascist men are in drag and they're marrying other men, right? So there's like these spheres of gender that are permeating here, but the sex itself is entirely extrapolated from of gender itself. And queerness, something I've been grappling with is like queerness as kind of like a depravity for Pasolini here. And if I can, I kind of want to look at a section from Leo Bersani's It's the Rectum of Grave, just really quickly, who talks about kind of where we can go when thinking about sex as extrapolated from identity politics, and sex as this module to get us to think outside of identity itself. But we also end, before I get to that, we do end the movie in a particularly interesting homosocial way, where we get Bruno and Claudio. I believe Claudio is the little twink that's like excited to join up with the fascists and excited to like participate in this. Same with, I think, Bruno kind of gets like pushed into it through, trying to hold on to his identity, but then that's destroyed. So he ends up kind of picking up this homosociality. And we get a very classic Eve Sedgwickian moment in her very famous edict between men, which is like all about triangulation. And the end of the movie, where Bruno and Claudio are dancing, and this, after this horrible scenes of just violence and blood, and Bruno and Claudio are talking about their girlfriends that are back home, while they're obviously like into each other and like boyfriends, in a horrible way to put that, but they're into each other. But I keep coming back to this moment in Bersani about how again, sex as this like way for queers, in Bersani's language, is to like totally disassemble our identities attached to ideologies wherein those ideologies can be conscripted to like really bad politics. So I'm thinking Bersani's writing in the age of AIDS. He's writing against people who are doing like machismo, dress ups and doing the hyper masculine thing, or like saying those things are kind of bad ways to go about doing sex. And he tells us, he writes at the very end, if you're following along, listener, he writes at the very end of Is the Rectum a Grave, 1987, if sexuality is socially dysfunctional in that it brings people together only to plunge them into a self-shattering and solipsistic jouance that drives them apart, it could also be thought of as our primary hygienic practice of non-violence. Gay man's obsession with sex, far from being denied, should be celebrated, not because of communal virtues, not because of its subversive potential as a parody of machismo, not because it offers a model of genuine pluralism to a society that at once celebrates and punishes pluralism, but rather because it never stops representing the internalized phallic male as an infinitely loved object of sacrifice. Male homosexuality advertises the risk of the sexual itself at the risk of self-dismissal, of losing sight of the self, and in doing it proposes and dangerously represent jouance as a mode of ascese. And I read that as the fascist model of sex in this movie, that like having these horrible like sexual relations with these kids is a way for them to continually detach from their Nietzschean identifications to something like a soul, or some sort of project of like self identification. Whereas on the converse, it's like we get Ava and another woman having queer sex that's totally punished because of it. And so there's all these different kind of models of gender that don't work, sex that don't work with gender, sexuality that can't work with sex and with gender. And Pasolini just seems to be putting all of them in a blender and saying, let's see what you can actually digest. And the people that are actually running this whole thing, like the Duke, I could come back to him, who is so profoundly antagonistic towards gender and towards sexuality, becomes maybe something Bersani would call like a symbol of pure sexual drive. And I like that Pasolini doesn't land on any terms, that all these sex and sexual and gendered operations have no consistency, but at the same time end up reaffirming the sort of power dynamics that everybody falls into in here, and especially the youths versus the fascists, the young women versus the young men, when they all start to tell on each other, becomes really interesting in those kind of power relations. Who deserves to live, who deserves to die, becomes predicated by those people with sort of semblances of agentic power, those youths who are trying to survive, who are trying to make themselves like agentic through all these horrible sexual complications. But I just think, of course, it's queerness equals depravity equals fascism is an easy way out. But I think there's a lot of interesting ways to say sex as extrapolated from gender works, sexuality can't work without gender, and then sex and gender can't cohesively work without the operation of sexuality, which is a very complicated matrix of thoughts there. But that's, yeah, what I've been thinking a lot about with this movie, and especially the sort of sadomasochistic torture of it all. Again, going back to, Bersani, pain as the organism's protection against self-dissolution, and thinking about what that means for the body to endure that through sexual conquering and rape and other horrible implications that these youths experience.
I think there's also times where we see the fascist libertines and where, you know, obviously upstream from that, Pasolini, as the writer of this film, um, constructs order or some minor semblance of order to have the libertines blow it to shreds with their unbridled drive or
Mm-hmm.
jouissance, right? So like we see the like molestation exercise that they say they're using it to determine the sex of the individuals, and then from there they stage a faux wedding ceremony, and then they attempt, which they do lock a man and a woman into, right, and seemingly
Mm-hmm.
heterosexual union, and then stage a situation where they are forcing them to engage in a sexual interaction together, but before consummation occurs they explode it, right,
Yeah.
with their
Mm-hmm.
destructive drive. So I think there are some ways in which, not that there's no, I'm not saying, 'cause I appreciate all your thoughts so much, Jared, but I think there is some level at which like gender and sex and also sexuality in this movie are tools of constructing order,
Mm-hmm.
and that is like why they are being utilized, as opposed to necessarily communicating something about like, I'm not saying you're saying this, but like Pasolini's like internalized conception of queerness, or whatever. Like I think it's like there are systems of order that can be assembled and dissembled in front of the viewer in ways that are easily signified visually.
And I think I'll say one more thing about it, is like you couldn't have, to kind of build off what you're saying, Hal, is like you couldn't have, I don't think, anybody else telling the stories of depravity that the two sex workers are telling, they're two women, right? That I think what, Pasolini is trying to get us to do is a gendered project in that like the rape of a 5-year-old, and do coming on her face that's like also smeared with blood is so horrifying because of its like 1970s gendered implications there. And so there's definitely, he's definitely attenuating that. I do think as the film progresses, those qualifications begin to fall apart. That we go from a little bit of a private, right? The first couple youths that are taken aside are kind of locked away, and then it increasingly becomes more and more public. That these models and systems of gender and sexuality become immutable and become, just balls of nonsense wrapped up in each other. But again, like gender is so important here as well. Like even though they kind of disappear, it stays because you have a woman who's telling the most horrifying story ever gleefully, and there's the sort of jouance of it all, and there's sort of the glee of it all that I don't think would be as effective if told from a different gender dynamic, and a sort of loss of innocence that those stories they tell imply as both like a plot driver and also just our descent into depravity. I don't think would be as effective at the time if they were, young men or older men telling these stories of depravity that they experience. Like, I don't
and
know. But
and in the triad that we talk about of like contemplation, what is it? No, I'm goofing it up. Contemplation, complicity, action, like in that triad, though we see the sex workers, the four women, like libertine storytellers, whatever, though we see them engage kind of like in that triad throughout the course of the 120 days, when it comes for the time of the fascist act of love, right,
mhm.
execution, they're not present,
Mm.
right? It's exclusively the men
Yeah.
who are involved in that act of trying to replicate love by pursuing an accomplice in destruction via death. So I do think there's something to chew on there. It's not totally legible to me, or it's not, I don't necessarily have some kind of like conclusion there, but I do think it's interesting that those final acts of voyeurism, complicity, and action, and what we know about the theoretical underpinnings in that bibliography, this idea that the executioner must kill repeatedly in pursuit of fascistic love, that something is being said there about gender. Something is being said there for sure. Okay, how about it? Let's get down to it.
Shit eating.
It's happening. So I want to say this as the up top on this. So I mentioned that I read several of the Criterion essays. Pasolini's friend Gideon Bachman, in a diary excerpt that was included in that release, recounts a story of trying to eat the concoction that I mentioned before, that's like a mix of chocolate and biscuits and orange marmalade, in the lunchroom on the set of the film.
Oh, I bet that was fun for everybody.
And he says, as usual, it's the idea of it that disgusts.
Yeah.
A perfect illustration of Kierkegaard. The event assumes its contents after the fact. History, seen backwards, creates its own significance. It is precisely what Pasolini is doing to Sade by resettling him in fascism. I didn't include the whole quote here, but he goes on to say that everybody else in the lunchroom did the same thing.
Nice.
Of like having tried it and going, I can't eat it,
Yeah.
So
that's like one time my mom made a meatloaf with that green ketchup.
Oh no,
I feel like that was a similar experience to the actors. So I feel like I kind of know what they
very
went through.
similar to 1974 Italy. Yeah, for sure. So what do y'all think the significance of the shit eating is?
I mean, I think obviously the like further degradation of the characters. And then one thing that I thought was really interesting in the documentary that I was watching, where Bertolucci again is featured, is that he said that he took that as another like angry Pasolini, being angry at how fascism and capitalists work together to create a culture of consumerism that literally just feeds us shit. And like this was kind of his cheeky way of being like, yeah, the capitalists, the fascists, they are creating this culture where they give us shit to eat and tell us it's good and we're going to enjoy it. And there was like kind of a meta commentary to that, and I feel like I relate kind of to that as what like maybe the deeper meaning of what he was trying to get across.
Yeah, I would say that is for sure accurate. There's another essay in the booklet by a professor named Naomi Green, who I think is a professor emeritus at University of California, Santa Barbara, who is like the Pasolini scholar, basically, has written several books about him, etc. And in her essay in it, which is called Breaking the Rules, she was very focused on the idea that Pasolini, this is a critique of fascism, but is very specifically a critique of capitalism,
sure.
and being forced into, his art being appropriated, digested outside of the framework that he wanted it to be presented in, that kind of thing. So I think that is really on point.
The term digested just made me go, ugh. I'm looking at my notes and it literally says, everyone is eating shit, underline.
Yeah, and it said, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, I guess like I'll perfectly honest, I couldn't watch a lot of this because I have a bum tum. I mean, I think it's interesting that it comes right after where we get this weird wedding ceremony where all the boys are naked, the girls are in tulle, and then it's sort of this stripping down bear, the bride strip bear of his bachelors. Speaking of Dada, which is some art on the wall there. But the moment that really resonated with me is when Sergio, who's forced to Mary is brought out of the dinner scene, and then he's crying. He has beautiful, that poor actor, he's so fucking good. He's covered in shit, and the president like kisses him and like pulls back, and
Oh
you know,
yeah, yeah.
Pasolini sits on his face, and he's just like has shit on his face, and he's kind of smiling. And to me that was just like, you know, degradation, depravity, the sort of, you know, every horrible thing that you both have said a couple times, like it was perfectly like achieved in that moment. This like very quiet moment outside of that horrible scene, because you kind of forget when you're watching it that everybody's eating shit, because the youths are acting really well because they're disgusted, but the fascists, the liberty fat, are just like eating it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
another
there is
day,
a
you know.
like
Mm.
really disquieting effect by the ways that each party reacts to it. That is like the disgust which we the audience have, and then switching to them like just lapping it up is
and
ugh.
and I think again, it's not, you know, like the horse. I know the horse is dead, and I'm continuing to kick it and beat it with a bat. But um, like if fascism is world destroying, right? That is the obviously the most baseline, most instinctual human principle, right? That you
Uh-huh.
don't fucking play with shit.
Yeah,
Like you
yeah, yeah.
not much less eat it, right? But then it goes
Mhm.
out, it never goes back in. It's basic, it's protectionary, right? Again, it's instinctual. And so I think that that's obviously, and it's like the degradation is an important part of it, but for the fascists in terms of them doing it themselves, right, comes down to this
Mhm.
principle of even the most foundational normative understandings of
Is
humanity
upset
are
by this. Yeah,
immaterial in
yeah.
this place, right? It's earth shattering. It's
Mhm.
a totally different world. um
And it's a
now
little bit of nihilism there too, because eating shit is
I would say a lot. I would say it's a lot of
yeah,
nihilism.
Yeah, yeah,
it's gonna kill you. You know, you get
Right.
fucking
Yeah.
C.
Like
diff, and
the
you're
outcome
yeah,
of
yeah,
it
yeah.
you're
is also
donezo.
immaterial to them. Right. And it's immaterial in the movie. Like it's not like we then see people terribly sick. Like the degradation is their experience of it. The emotional experience is the suffering. Not, we
Mhm.
don't see people sick and ill or consequences of this, right?
Right.
We see
Yeah, yeah.
multiple scenes of this happening, including the fascists, including the tales from the, you know, the storyteller delighting in the man who loves nasty shit. It's
Yeah.
horrible,
Oh.
horrible things. So and our last bit in talking about this before we move on to talking about the series as a whole, because I think this is gonna end up being like a 3 hour long episode. Oh my god.
Yeah, we're doing
Is
all right.
I wanted to ask y'all about just to me, I think one of the things that I walked away from this episode walked away from watching the movie this in this instance was that before, when I saw the movie, these disgusting elements were, it was almost like a battle of will, like can I do
Right. Yeah,
it?
yeah.
And in this instance I was really moved by how much it affected me,
Mhm.
not just in like I can't watch this is hard to watch, but like I was like crying, gagging, like shaking. I was making so much noise. I was watching the movie on Zoom with Jared, on DVD or Blu-ray, whatever, in our bedroom, which is the back of the house, and Mike was watching something in the living room, and he came and shut the door. He was like, "You're making too much noise. I don't want to hear the disgusting noises you're making," because I'm just in there like um and I found it to be like having that experience while watching the movie, I found to be emotionally stirring. Like I found it
Mhm.
to be not titillating, but and not just scandalizing, but like but moving and emotionally challenging.
100%. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It was the point of no return, and it made it almost like the last scene of torture, right? The last act is horrible and really hard to watch, but it like made that easier to watch
Truly,
because of
yeah.
how like I mean, Pasolini just sits on his camera in that scene. He just makes
Yeah.
us watch people have dinner, quote unquote dinner, and you're just watching this shit dinner that when we get to them like really beautiful that great camera thing he did with you're just like watching through like a whatever telescope, you're watching those horrible scenes of torture. It honestly, I was like so desensitized at that point that I
Yeah,
was like,
yeah,
okay, we're beyond that. And honestly, again, I come back to that moment with Sergio and the president as being the kind of denouement. Like
yeah.
I couldn't come back. Like Sergio's pure terror and sadness, and that actor was incredible. I wish I wrote down his name, but he was incredible. And the president just smiling with shit all over his face. It was so fucking disgusting that by the time I'm watching guys get their tons cut out and their dicks, ripped off, like it was
Scalps.
another
Yeah, with the
scalp. It was
scalpel.
another day
I
in
am
paradise. I was like, okay, it's whatever. It's what Hal was saying. It's like the self-citation of shit, right? As postmodern art often tells us, like people like Kiki Smith, right? Just like I'm thinking that
Yeah.
sculpture of the intestines coming back into the body,
Right.
and
It
it's
comes
just
out of me and then I push it back out.
yeah, it's like a
Or then I push it
beautiful
back in.
metaphor of fascism, right? That there's no external except for the thing which you consume. And to me, I never came back. I was, I guess, just totally desensitized for the rest of the movie. I mean, I was grossed out. I was sad, but that was I was done. So
yep.
I ran away. I don't know if Hal saw me. I like
Yes,
got
I
up and like
did. Yeah.
ran
I was
away
like, did
for
someone just
like
smoke a cigarette?
I went to quote unquote pee, which was me trying not to,
Watch the shit.
yeah.
Well, and there's also I think, again, to kind of feed into this idea of like the frustrated drive that is like never actually like the libertines can't actually fulfill their desire. When we see these final violent acts take place, the sense of joy and playfulness that we saw elsewhere in the movie is gone,
Mhm.
and they are like yelling, they're like screaming, they're the self-control, which is, I know they're doing horrible disgusting things, so referring to that as self-control, but I just mean that like self-presentation being controlled is totally out the window.
Gone. Yeah.
And I think that also speaks to something that Pasolini is saying here, which is that like I think again, it's just like destruction begets destruction from the top to the bottom. Like no one is free of it, and that doesn't mean that we're doing some like both sidesism of like the violators are victims. It's not that they're victims. It's just that ultimately their humanness is violated by their own actions,
Mm.
right? Like
Mhm.
they betray their own humanness, and they cannot rise above, right, or achieve some higher state of being because they are dragged to the bottom, by their own unfulfilled desires that they have continually pushed all boundaries and destroyed everything in pursuit of.
I mean, absolutely. And I think going, however far back we've gone to like the Nietzsche stuff, it's like those questions of soul and all the theological questions surrounding Nietzsche like kind of fall away because you have no moral morality at all. And in that moment, again, I keep going back to Sergio and just the look on his face and the fact that they pull him out of there and he's on the stairwell and it's this really it's close-ups and we don't get a lot of close-ups in this movie, but we get a close-up on that moment, and it's that moment where all of a sudden there's no morality. Morality's gone, and it's what makes this movie very sad. It's not even just perverse and disgusting. It's one of the saddest movies I've seen in a very long time.
Yeah.
It-
Um, well, before we get to wrapping up the series as a whole, I did want to mention one thing which we kind of talked about, but the idea of like audience complicity and the like filmic language that creates that. I was watching a thing about, because there was a big uproar when this came out that the movie is pornographic, which is an odd thing to call a movie like this. And in one of the documentaries, someone was describing, it might have been Bertolucci again, honestly, but someone was describing why it isn't pornographic. And the point that they came to was almost every like depraved act or act of like sexuality is filmed in wide, not close up, right? And he says in the documentary, he said, if you watch a pornography movie, they're close up, they're showing you the goods or whatever. With this, it is zoomed out, so you are getting the whole picture of the room that you're in, almost like, and he says like you take in all the unsexiness of just the surroundings, which is like not what you would want in something that's supposed to be erotic, and it makes you as the viewer be in the room with them while this is happening. So that idea that almost nothing is in close up, I think, is intentional to make us feel more like immediate in that. And I think that's a stark change too, because some of the only close-ups we get are at the end when they're looking at the violence that's happening through the binoculars, and we get that filter or whatever over the screen as if like we are the ones looking through the binoculars. So I just really like kind of the like subtle filmic language that is making the audience complicit in what you see happening on screen.
And he cascades it too. When you start the movie where they're recruiting the youths, you are actually looking at dicks and vaginas. Like it's not far away. You know, they make two guys pull down their pants and they look at their dicks and they're like,
yeah,
good dicks. Hell yeah, brother. And then they go to a woman and they make her strip and they're kind of a little more zoomed out. But as we go, like I think Renata and Sergio are first married, like Hal was saying earlier, like you're not watching that consummation. You are so far removed from that you're just totally zoomed out. Like,
yep.
And you know, Hal can speak to my enthusiasm for a penis, and there are so many penises in this movie that I was like, it just nut. I was like, I don't care. Put them away. Run.
Put them away.
Run away. But
also,
yeah, I think that's really nice reading there.
Nope, lost it.
All right.
God damn. That happens to me at least once an episode where I go, hey, nope.
You know, it's not, the thought isn't ready to climb out of the primordial ooze yet. But you know, it is a transition to talking about the series as a whole. Yeah. So I'm going to pose a question to get us kicked off. So we have talked about over the last 3 episodes, Salò 120 Days of Sodom, 1975, directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini.
Oh.
We have talked about The Conformist in 1970, directed by Bertolucci. Bernardo Bertolucci. And then we have talked about The Dam, 1969, Luciano Visconti. Perfect. No notes. So to launch into our discussion across these 3 films, I want to pose this. I've repeatedly at least talked about fascism as a history destroying project. Do you think then that Visconti, Bertolucci, and Pasolini are engaged in the practice of history making?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, well, so many of these are like, all of these movies are made in the kind of immediate aftermath and, 20 years or so of fascist Italy. And I think that there is like an active attempt to set the record straight, I think, on what fascism is and what it does and what it did to Italy. So yeah, I think there is like a conscious effort of history making while talking about a thing that is history altering or history destroying, for sure.
Right. Trying to insert some level of narrative and structure.
Or just agency too, a way of like, Italy was defined by this like powerful, awful thing for so long that like this, like, we need a perspective on it that is going to stand the test of time and kind of set the record straight almost. um yeah.
Yeah, I think The Conformist to me was the most like textual, historically textual
Mhm.
of the three. Like I learned a lot as I was watching that movie. Like I remember Hal and I texting after we watched it, like learning about the castor oil shit. I think there is a lot more like kind of sense of realism. Like like people escaping fascism, what that kind of looks like, what that could mean to senses of freedom, what that would engender when you're thinking about like models of normativity of what it means to live a life as a liberal agent, quote unquote. Um, the Damned, in a way, like got me back into a history again, but again, hyperbolized. I think in a lot of ways. I'm thinking specifically about the massacre of the SA scene, which I would love to talk more about. But
Oh, the
I
Nazi
think,
fuck party.
yeah, Nazi fuck party, baby.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think the conformist taught me a lot, and I believed it, and I could see that movie being like a real thing, that could happen. And I learned quite a bit. Salo, no, it was just horrifying and deprived, and it made me think. I mean, I learned stuff, but I also had to, uh, contend with a lot of the deeper philosophical aspects that
I
maybe are historical. Sorry.
Yeah, I think by history making, I don't necessarily mean like blocking in historical facts,
Right.
but more so like trying to ascribe meaning or
Mhm.
structure experience through meaning making. And so a thing that I see across, especially the first two movies, but also in this film, is trying to grapple with the motivations of fascists through a psychoanalytic framework that infuses the writing of the film. So the way the motivations of Martine
Hmm.
and the other von Essenbach family members are like seemingly attached to these like Freudian
Hmm.
subconscious desires or unconscious desires, even associated with like fragmented family form. And the way in The Conformist, right, that Marcelo is motivated by these again unconscious desires that he can't fully recognize or engage, but they compel him to action, or to inaction. And then I would say that we also see some of that a little less explicitly, a little bit more submerged, as it relates to the motivations and drives of the libertine characters. And some of we talked about this idea that their jouissance is ultimately frustrated and can't be fulfilled, and so they're locked in this like repetitious effort that will never be fulfilling.
Mhm.
So I think there's an effort at meaning making that really calls on a lot of Freudian ideas and is trying to grapple with like what's inside of the head of people whose heads we can't get
Yeah.
into,
I
by
was
people
just
who live through fascism.
I was just about to say, I think one of the things that obviously connects all these movies is the social construction of reality, and we see that so very prevalently in The Conformist when they have an actual conversation about the allegory of the cave, right? But I think what The Damned and The Conformist do well is a kind of as kind of replicating what you're saying there, Hal, is like they're seeking a kind of complication of the social construction where I think Salo wants us extracting that. And there's a character in Salo that is this sort of like pinnacle of what we might say empathy, which is a piano player who you see her in the beginning of the movie and she looks uncomfortable. She's not jovial as everybody else is. And then what does she do towards the end? She jumps out of a fucking window and kills herself, right? Like, so there's this person there that kind of represents the viewer in a way that you're seeing this person who's kind of, you know, participatory in the banality of it all, but can extract themselves from it. And maybe that piano player is more significant than I think we given time to her as our way to get out of like an Arnettian version of fascist ideology. Whereas I think like the damned and the conformists more as like, "Ooh, should I, shouldn't I?" And the damned of being more of what happens when other ideologies are getting stronger than the ideology you hold onto yourself, and then Salo being the absolute maximalism of that. And then you get a person who's just playing piano and then jumps out of a window to, you know, get away from it all.
Yeah, I think the piano player is almost like, you know, in the allegory of the cave idea, is like someone that realizes they're looking at shadows and leaves
Mhm.
regardless of the risks of
Yeah.
leaving without knowing what's outside. And then the conformist is someone, you know, Marcelo is someone that knows that he's looking at shadows dancing on the wall of the cave, but is too afraid of the risks of what's outside and refuses to leave. And then in The Damned, it's like a group of people who are all, you know, they're a family and they're tied together through family and class interests. And because of that, they are totally uninterested in the reality, like whether or not those are
Mhm.
shadows, because
Mhm.
they're all invested in the myth collectively,
Right.
and
Yeah.
it suits them and it benefits them to maintain the collective myth.
As long as the shadows are two boys kissing,
Yeah.
that's important.
Hell yeah. Well, is that all we have on Salò?
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
put up
I
a good
said my
showing
piece.
there. I think
Hell
we
yeah.
fought a good fight. I have a bedtime.
Hey, me
Thank
too.
you guys so much for having me on here. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you so
much
much
Blast.
for
for
coming, for
joining
joining
us.
us.
Yes, and this was really fun doing
All
our
of our hair has gone increasingly bigger throughout this. Like we're all like swiping our hair as we talk about Nietzsche and shit and queerness. I love
Oh God, gotta let the hair down when we're talking about
it.
Nietzsche and shit,
I've said
literally.
shit eating too many times on this podcast, but this has been a really fun little series of these were all first time watches for me. So I was nope, Salah wasn't, but the other two were, and it was just I really enjoyed this series. And do we want to tease what our next series
Yes,
is?
absolutely.
It is a spooky season because Halloween is coming up, so we are changing our tune a little bit and doing some movies that are a little bit more digestible, fun.
Fun.
So for Halloween, first we are gonna watch Brian Usna's 1989 film Society.
Fucking hooting and hollering. Honestly, I'm really glad that we're covering it
Yeah.
as of the three immediately after Salo, because I think it's a great companion piece.
Oh yeah,
Like the two of them actually would be a really insane midnight feature.
I've not seen Society before.
Oh my god!
But I am
you
I
aware.
seen
haven't
Society,
either.
Jared?
No, we're gonna watch
Holy
it together
shit.
though.
Yeah,
You guys
We'll
I'm
are in
call
for a
me. We'll
time.
figure it out.
Yeah.
You're in for a fucking time. I can't wait.
And then after that, we're gonna do Wes Craven's 1991 film, The People Under the Stairs.
Sick.
And finally, for our Halloween episodes, if you listened last year, we did the original Candyman. This time we're gonna watch Candyman 2021, directed by Nia DaCosta, which is a reboot sequel
Starring my boyfriend,
situation. Yeah,
Yamahin Mateen.
Mateen, yeah, I love him too. And you said you haven't seen Candyman yet.
Correct. I have not.
I think you will enjoy it, and your boyfriend is great in it.
Yeah, he's
he's
very
great
talented.
but
Yeah, he's really talented. He should be in more things that aren't DC movies. I'm putting that out there
What's
in
the DC
universe.
movie that he's in?
He's Manta in the Aquaman
that barely
movies.
even counts. No,
I mean, that's what he's been doing.
Yeah.
So
Wait, he's been in more than once?
he's been in two, I think.
Jesus Christ Almighty!
Yeah.
I did not know that. I didn't know he was in the second one.
Yeah, but you know what else he's great in? Watchmen, the HBO
Yes,
miniseries.
he is. And isn't he the boyfriend in The Invisible Man?
Is he?
Is that him?
I don't think
it's
so.
Is it not him?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Oh no. Well,
But so ignore that.
he's great in everything except the Invisible Man, because that's not him. But yeah, so we will start those. I think both of us are like frantically looking up the Invisible Man at this moment to see.
Yeah, it's Aldous Hodge.
Okay, well, he's not in the Invisible Man. That's somebody else. But we will watch those movies for our upcoming episodes. But thank you all for listening, and we will.
Bye-bye.